This is part 5 and the final part of my lecture on Augustine. Augustine himself isn't quite fully satisfied with the solutions to the problem of evil that we've discussed. He seems to understand that even if evil is not a substance but a privation of good, and even if what we call evil is, when considered in the grand scheme of things, good, there still seems to remain a certain wickedness that hasn't yet been reconciled with the existence of an all good, all powerful being. Augustine explains that he has in mind his own wickedness, that is, his sexual habit, and in general, any human choice that is a perversity of the will towards inferior things. In other words, Augustine wants to know why an all good, all powerful being would allow some people to choose to do what is wicked. And why would an all good, all powerful being create people who are inclined to do what is wicked? Who made me? Is not my God not only good, but the supreme good? Why then have I the power to will evil and to reject good? Augustine reasons that because whatever God wills is good, then Augustine himself must be good, and so must his will. But unlike God, Augustine is not incorruptible. Thus the source of his power to choose the wicked is in some sense derived from God, since God created Augustine's will. But God gave Augustine free will, and God cannot be held responsible for what Augustine chooses to do by means of his own free will. So according to the free will solution to the problem of evil, God cannot be held responsible for moral evils like murder, theft, and cheating, because such activities do not result from God. Instead, moral evils are the result of a perverse or deficient will. Such an explanation is often referred to as a free will solution to the problem of evil. Augustine now considers a certain issue that arises with respect to the free will solution. He notes that God is not only all good, but also all knowing. He writes, "What can be unforeseen by you, who knows all things?" And that means that God knows not only everything that has happened and everything that is happening, but God also knows what will happen. In other words, God has foreknowledge of future events. Now, because God is all knowing, and because God has foreknowledge, God would know that Augustine would choose to steal the pears before God even created Augustine. But if, before Augustine was even born, God knew that Augustine was going to steal the pears, then it looks like there's only one possible future for Augustine when he was born, the one possible future that includes his stealing the pears. For if God knows that Augustine will steal the pears, and then Augustine chooses not to steal the pears, then it seems that God must have been mistaken. But of course, an all knowing being can never be mistaken. So it would seem that if God knows that Augustine will steal the pears, then Augustine must steal the pears, since it's the only possible choice that he can make, given God's foreknowledge of it. But if Augustine must steal the pears, and it's the only possible choice that he can make, then it no longer seems like Augustine's will is free. In response to such an objection, Augustine tends to argue that although God foreknew that Augustine would steal the pears, God did not force Augustine to do so. Augustine's stealing the pears was an act of will, and whatever results from his will is free, as long as no one forces him to act in the way that he chooses to act. So even though there's only one possible way that the future can play out, namely in the way that God knows that it will, because Augustine steals the pears as a result of his own will, he stole the pears freely. But now a new problem arises. Because Augustine is committed to the view that God knows how the world and everything in it will play out, it seems that Augustine is committed to the doctrine of divine predestination. But if the fate of each of us is predestined at birth, then it seems that God predetermined the lives of those who do evil things and thus fated them to suffer for eternity in hell. Some might even wonder why an all good God would preordain that any created being would be eternally damned. There's one other possible objection that one might raise against Augustine's account of free will. One might argue that if God is perfect and all good, then God could have created a bunch of beings with free will, people who God knew would always choose to do the good. In other words, it would seem that an all good, all powerful God could have created a world that is populated only by beings much like us, people who, for the most part, never choose to intentionally inflict unjustified hurt on others. Thus, some might wonder, if everyone was created by an all-good, all-powerful being, why are there jerks in the world? You might want to pause here for a moment to consider the free will solution, the objections that were raised against it, and see whether you can come up with some responses to those objections. I'm going to turn now towards the end of Book 7, where Augustine begins to work towards the belief that there can be non-physical substances. Augustine provides an argument supporting the claim that something unchangeable must exist. The argument is influenced by the Neoplatonist account of the hierarchy of being. Augustine's reasoning is also very similar to Plato's argument, showing that we are born with a knowledge of equality. Again, recall Professor Dardis's lecture on the Phaedo. Plato reasons something like this. When I look at two lines drawn in the sand, if I can see that the two lines are very close to being equal, but I judge that they're not perfectly equal, it must be the case that I have an understanding of perfect equality, or the form of equal, in order to make that judgment. Plato argues that I cannot come to have an understanding of perfect equality by examining and measuring a bunch of different physical lines, because nothing physical can be perfectly equal. Thus, Plato concludes, I must have been born with an understanding of equality in order to judge that any two lines are not perfectly equal. Augustine's reasoning that he has an understanding of the unchangeable is somewhat similar to Plato's argument. Earlier, we saw that Augustine mentions that he's absolutely certain of the truth that 7 plus 3 equals 10. He calls such a truth an eternal truth because it never changes. Augustine also reasons that he can know that he has a mind because he knows that he is thinking. But he also recognizes that his mind is mutable and changing. Augustine then reasons that the unchanging eternal truth must transcend his changing mind and his mutable human reasoning. So on the hierarchy of being, truth would go above his human mind and reasoning. Bodies are changeable and not capable of reasoning, so they go below souls and minds and human reasoning. And now Augustine realizes that in placing bodies below human minds and human minds below truth, he's making a certain judgment. He's making the judgment that the unchangeable is preferable to the changeable. And just as Plato argued that in order to make a judgment about equality, one must have an understanding of equality, so Augustine now argues that in order for him to make a judgment about what is unchanging, he must have an understanding of the unchangeable. And so he writes, unless I could somehow know the unchangeable, there would be no certainty in preferring it to the mutable. This seems to be the moment when Augustine begins his transition from the Manichaeistic materialist account towards a spiritual, supernatural account. But he then explains that he isn't quite ready for that transition. He explains, my weakness reasserted itself, and I returned to my customary condition. In another work, Augustine goes on with the argument to show that the hierarchy of being provides proof that God exists. Augustine explains that it is either the case that there is something superior to truth, and that would be God, or it is the case that God is truth, and either way, it must be the case that God exists. For if God is truth, then God exists, and if God is greater than truth, then God must exist. And in this way, Augustine appeals to the hierarchy of being to prove that a non-physical God exists. So after adopting and then rejecting a couple of other belief systems, Augustine eventually adopts Christianity. As we've seen, he develops an account of God that is in many ways appropriated from the views of Plato as they were interpreted by the Neoplatonists. Augustine writes that it is an independent, immaterial, transcendent reality who exists in a supernatural realm outside of space and time and outside of the physical natural world, an account of God that influences the way that Westerners think about God to this day. But as we've also seen, the problem of evil is used by some to prove that God does not exist. This is the end of my lecture on Augustine and the problem of evil. I leave you to think about Augustine's solution to the problem of evil. Do you think that his solutions, either on their own or working together, provide an adequate response to the problem of evil? Can his solutions help us to respond to personal and political crises?